Hello to our F11 members again, and welcome to the fundamentals of post-production video tutorials. Today what I'd like to do for you in two parts is go through the process of how I stitch together my panoramas. If you've not done it before, hopefully you'll realize just how easy it is, and it will open up a whole new world for you. Now, in the accompanying behind the lens feature in this issue, I'm writing about my trip to Utah, the first few days in Arches National Park, and this session is mentioned where I had this fabulous snowy conditions here and just finally got underway with the trip after a slow start. And I mentioned about making a panorama. So here are the images, basically 11 pictures that I am now going to piece together. And as I shot those images, the key things to consider are, first of all, you plan your composition, realizing that you're going to give yourself a bit more leeway to the left and the right than you probably need, because you can always crop down to suit afterwards. Secondly, the camera needs to remain absolutely dead level. So you can see in this picture here, I've got my Jeep in the bottom of the frame. Clearly I don't want that, but because I can't just angle the camera up, it has to be dead level. I had to include that, knowing that I'm just going to crop off the bottom third of the picture to suit. And generally speaking, that's pretty normal. You're always leaving yourself a bit more area to work with. Need to crop it down. We'll still have loads of information to make a huge big image. So the thing I need to do now is look at the corrections, or shall we say adjustments, that I'm going to make to process the pictures here in Lightroom, as I would do with any other image. The only slight complication is that whatever I do to, say, this picture here, I have to do to each and every one of them. So you'll notice here the exposure information I shot with 105mm focal length, and what I'm going to do is apply those same corrections to this image and apply them to all these as well. When I exposed, the exposure was exactly the same for each and every frame, so therefore that just makes the job of stitching them together much easier. If you realize that if there are exposure differential between two frames, you just wouldn't get an even match. The other thing to consider is you can see the clouds here in the frame, and there was a fair breeze moving these clouds through the frame, and any kind of movement discrepancy between the two images, the movement of the clouds from one frame to the other, would cause problems. So when I'm doing a panorama, I need to actually work from left to right so that they're arranged in Lightroom as I'm going to see them, but I also need to get a move on and do these overlapping frames as quickly as I possibly can, so that there's less movement of the clouds in between each frame. Okay, so let's get on with it now, shall I? So the first thing I'm going to look at is basically look at this image and say, well, how am I going to process it? And as usual, the first thing I look at is the histogram, and in fact it's a perfect histogram, a complete range of tones. Bear in mind, I don't really have the scope to start making adjustments, because any clipping that I did to this one could cause problems with this one. So in fact the histograms are very similar. Go to the end one here. I could move in the white point there on that image, but I don't want to, because it would cause problems with the others. So all I've done is basically put a very, very shallow curve on the tone curve to just introduce a little bit of contrast, the tiniest touch of contrast into the image here, and as usual I've adjusted my sharpening with just a touch of masking, and that's it. That's all I've done. Now the next thing I would do is, having done my adjustments for this one image, is then I'd select all the others that I'm going to process to make the panorama, and we just go. Come on, Noton, get on with it. Like so, comme ça, and then this tool here, sync. If I hit this, synchronize, it's going to apply the exact same adjustments to all the images. And that's it. And now I'm just going to export them all. So I go Library, Export, and I've created a folder called Utah, and I'm going to put them in a subfolder called Pano, and I'm going to rename it to Arches with keeping that file number there. You'll all have your system of doing this, but whatever you do, have a system and stick to it, so there's consistency in whatever you do. We know this from previous tutorials, but it never hurts to go through again. I'm exporting it as a TIFF. I'm exporting it in the color space Prophoto RGB, which has the widest gamut and a bit depth of 16-bit per color image. It's going to make a big image. No resizing, it's full size, resolution set at 300, sharpening's been set already, and now I'm going to export them. Just on a word about panoramas, it does take a meticulous approach actually at the time of shooting to make sure everything is set the way it should be, with exposures and also your tripod dead level. But the beauty of this is you really don't need specialist equipment. If you have, first of all, a decent tripod, and if you have Photoshop, you are capable of making panoramas, and that's a great liberation. So I'm now finished with that, with Lightroom. So I'm going to go to Photoshop now, and I'm using Photoshop CS6 here, but whatever you're using, I don't think you can do this in Elements, but any other version of Photoshop, you just go Automate Photo Merge, and it brings up this bar. I've forgotten to do something, excuse me. We'll just go back. What I need to do is open first the images that I'm talking about, and here they all are. I've got two of them actually, so if you just stick with me, I'm going to go 1, 2, 3. So I'm opening up all the images that are going to be stuck together. I'm doing this in real time deliberately, just so that you get an idea of how long it takes, and you know, literally within 15 minutes you can, or less, you can put together a panorama. It's really quite amazing. Okay, so as I said before, we go File, Automate, Photo Merge, and then it comes up with these options here. First thing I'm going to do is say Add Open Files. So these are the images it's going to have a go at sticking together to make a panorama. Now what about these? Which one to go for? Personally, I virtually always use cylindrical for landscape work. Perspective, it looks a bit strange, starts trying to stretch the edges to keep the perspective across the frame the same. Auto, you're never quite sure what it's going to do. Spherical, it could be worth experimenting with, but I find cylindrical the most useful. Okay, so down here I've checked the box for blend images together. If I was worried about vignetting of the images, I would tick here, but I'm not. I didn't see any vignetting issues on any of the images, so that's okay. Next thing I do is just say Add Open Files, and sorry, next thing I just say OK, and now it starts to work on the image and stitch it together. And I'm going to keep this running in real time so you get an idea of what's going on. And the thing is that if you think about it, each image is pretty big to start with, because okay, I shot these pictures with my 5D Mark III, which outputs a 16-bit full-size TIFF as 126 megabytes, and there are 11 images to work on, so 11 times 126 is what, sort of 1.3 or 1.4ish gigabytes. So that's a lot of information. It's going to make a very big picture, and really the way to look at these images is as a huge print, but we'll come to that. And it's now munching on all that information. This stage of the process, generally speaking, I'll put the kettle on and come back and watch it piece together the image, and it's really quite magic when you see it pop up on the screen, your finished panorama. Bear in mind the things that could cause you problems with panoramas or any kind of movement between individual frames. Obviously getting the tripod level means that makes everything so much easier. It's actually the hardest part of the whole process. And it's got up here all the images that open that it's working on, plus it's creating this untitled panorama up here. And while it creates this seamless composition, we sit back and wait. And there it is, and it's pretty incredible, isn't it, really? Now clearly this is only the start. There's a fair bit that I need to do to this picture yet. First thing I'm going to do is shut down all the other images, the individual images, and we'll see you back here in part 2 to finish working on this panorama in Photoshop. Thank you.